Hello, hello. So my name is Vili Lehdonvirta. I work at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I think the connection to Brendan's talk will be the word heterogeneity. So I was asked to talk about fragmentation, and I'm cobbling this talk together mainly from two sources. One is a chapter of mine that just came out in a book called Space, Place, and Virtual Work. And the other is the project that I'm doing together with Mark Graham, Alex Wood, and some other people. And yeah, so what I kind of maybe lose in fluency, hopefully I gain in relevance, because I've been this talk has been developing during the day as I've been listening to your excellent talks. It's been a really interesting day so far. And before I jump into the talk itself, let me also mention that I've just started another project called iLabor, and that addresses, I'm pleased to say, that some of the topics that were identified earlier as topics of particular concern. Guy Standing referred to the lack of statistics, or the fact that today's labor market statistics are sort of lagging behind the reality. And my team member Otto Kässi, labor economist, is working on new statistics. We have a panel of 30,000 online workers. And also Alex will be in this project addressing the very pertinent question of, well, how do workers in this kind of a platform economy attempt to assert their interests collectively? What are possibly the new forms of collective action, how successful or unsuccessful they are? But that's future. So as for now, let me, just a brief outline of the talk is I'm going to talk about diversity of inputs, the diversity of people that go into these online labor platforms, diversity of outcomes, a large variety of outcomes that people experience from these platforms, and then finally talk about what is the role of the platform in potentially sort of generating that kind of diversity, fragmentation, or heterogeneity in outcomes. And a thread that I will try to kind of weave all through is, what implications does this have for collective action and labor organizing? That seems to have been like a topic of concern today. Let me first set up a sort of straw man to fight against. So it's a quote from Capital, Marx. But the idea is that the straw man is that in this socio-technical system known as the factory, an assembly line, work is commodified. Commodification automatically leads into this kind of unification and massification of the workforce. Workers share the same workplace, same tasks, same working hours, same boss. They sleep in the same factory barracks. They develop, first of all, it becomes class in itself, people with similar interests, similar circumstances, but also a class for itself. They recognize themselves as sharing interests. So kind of the question that I'm going to be asking, well, how does this fancy new socio-technical system or arrangement called the online labor platform, or there's a huge variety of different ones, but they also commodify notoriously labor. Do they also lead to this kind of then birth of class identities and shared interests? And basically I'm going to argue that no. First let's talk about the inputs, people going into these platforms. And we're doing a survey on this at the moment, but for now I'm going to have to rely on surveys done by other people, plus some interviews that I have done and also we have done in this new project on the types of people that seek income from different platforms, using Amazon Mechanical Turk as an example to begin with. So this is a picture that shows in response to a survey question about what is the relationship of earnings from Mechanical Turk. What is the importance of those earnings to the person? And the study itself can be questioned on methodological grounds for various reasons. But the main point is just to kind of draw attention to the fact that people approach these platforms with very different interests and needs. So we have some people who are cobbling together their income from different precarious sources, and earning a little bit extra from Mechanical Turk can be really important for them. I spoke with Tony, a US a student in the United States, also a father and a part-time pizza delivery man. And he was working on Mechanical Turk, and it was important for him. Those earnings were important for him to support himself and his studies. But then there are also people who say that Mechanical Turk money is irrelevant to me, or nice, but not materially important. I spoke with Amy, a librarian in a full-time, stable employment relationship in a library. But the library was often quite quiet. There wasn't much work to do. So she would, on her phone, on her smartphone, she would do some Mechanical Turk tasks, earn a little bit of extra money, and keep herself busy. So she was literally working 2 jobs at the same time. And then we spoke in South Africa. We spoke with Cedric, who was a meter reader. So he would walk around Cape Town reading electricity meters. And whilst doing that, he was also working on his mobile phone, doing tasks that involved checking location data. So when you use a car navigator or you go on Google Maps, all of that data has to be entered and verified and updated by someone. So he was doing, amongst other things, this kind of tasks, whilst also working as a meter reader. So, and many other examples that we could talk about of people who come from very difficult, precarious circumstances, and people who do it for other reasons. Well, let me mention one more. There was an American homemaker who had, whose partner was in a salaried, well-earning job, so they were not, they didn't really need any extra income. But she still worked on Mechanical Turk, and it was important for her self-confidence that she had some money that she had earned independently of her husband. So it was also an identity thing, and the thing that played into the power relationship in that relationship. So, given that sort of people approach these platforms, and I'm a bit generalizing now by saying that just by these observations we can say that everyone in other platforms is the same. There's very different kinds of platforms. It's important to recognize that. But still, I will make the claim that people come from diverse backgrounds and circumstances, and indeed that's one of the goals of these platforms often is to try to attract as large a pool of workers as possible. And so that means that there aren't necessarily shared interests around which to organize, no class in itself. It also means, in many cases, that it is hard for shared identities to develop, class for itself. In my interviews, mainly the shared interests that I saw, the shared identities that I saw were organized around national lines. The American Mechanical Turk workers had their own English-speaking online forum, and none of the Indian workers were there, and the Indian workers had their own channels of communication. And the American workers were sometimes using quite racialized language about the Indian workers, and held these kind of country stereotypes about their performance and motivation and so on. And so it was quite geographically fragmented, this identity of a Turker. Whereas if you wanted to engage in some kind of collective action in a transnational marketplace, then you would have to be able to have a unified identity, not one that is fragmented along geographic lines. Then switching to outputs, and here I'm going to now I warn you, I'm going to jump into a completely different platform now, not Mechanical Turk. Mechanical Turk is actually quite small and it's overstudied. Everyone, including me, talks about Mechanical Turk because it is such a stark example of commodification. But Mark already spoke about Upwork and various other platforms. Upwork is, by turnover, the largest, I'm quite confident to say, online labor marketplace or platform with facilitating transactions to a total value of about $1 billion US dollars per year. And Mark already sort of showed some screenshots of these platforms and talked about how they work, so I won't talk about that in detail. So what I have here is we got 6 months worth of transaction data from Upwork, and I played around that a little bit for the purposes of this presentation to look at what are the outcomes to workers in terms of heterogeneity. And first of all, if we look at, so this is distribution of contractor monthly earnings, or earnings per month. And what we can see here is that the vast majority of contractors are earning something in the order of a few dollars per month. It's nothing. But then there seems to be this long tail that continues up to $1,000. And in fact, if we zoom out a bit, the tail just keeps on going up to $50,000. So we get a very, very long tail. So large diversity in terms of outcomes. And remember, this doesn't include all of those people who tried to get work, tried to get earnings, but couldn't. So in our interviews, with people who work through Upwork and similar platforms, often we heard that they tried to get work for months and they couldn't. So there's a huge diversity of outcomes between those who get no work and apparently some contractors, and I will get back to who these might be, who seem to be earning tens of thousands of dollars per month. And this is log data from the server, so this is actual money paid out. Another way to look at the same data, so each dot represents one contractor sorted by earnings. Earnings are on the y-axis. We see that there is a very sort of kind of small elite of workers who earn significant amounts, or contractors, I should say. And then finally, if we kind of draw a Lorentz curve out of that proportion of contractors, proportion of share of earnings, we can see that about 80% of workers, contractors, earn about 20% of all the money that's changing hands on the platform. Or to put it the other way around, the top 20% earn about 80% of all the money. And again, this is only including people who succeeded, contractors who succeeded in earning at least something from the platform. So basically, yes, the picture is one of a huge diversity of outputs or outcomes for the market. And the same, if I drew the same analysis for number of contracts the contractor was able to win, or the hourly rate that they were able to get from a contract, a similar picture would emerge. So to make some sense of this finding of huge diversity of outcomes, well, first of all, we realized that, well, there were very different types of people going in. Some only wanted to do, a few gigs in a month and earn very small amounts of money, whereas some were trying to turn it into a full-time job. So perhaps it was not a surprise that the outcomes are as diverse. But there was also, and this now also links to Brendan's talk, there was also some entrepreneurship evident. So when you go on as a user, as someone who wants to purchase work on these platforms, you often see, in Upwork at least, you see faces of individual people and names. So it looks like I am contracting directly with an individual. over the internet somewhere far away. And that is kind of the wow, 5 minutes ago. That is kind of the picture that is usually drawn of these, that there are buyers somewhere in the global north and sellers somewhere in the global south, and the online labor market sort of facilitates these one-to-one connections between these buyers and sellers. It's disintermediated. But one of the things we found when we then actually went to meet these people in different countries was that what already Mark mentioned briefly was that very often there was some kind of a hierarchy or network structure re-emerging. It was not always one-to-one. It was in many cases not one-to-one trade. Mark mentioned re-intermediation, where one contractor would get a lot of contracts and then they would simply contract them, subcontract them through the same marketplace even to other people and take a cut from between. So they were exploiting their advantageous position in the network, essentially their reputation score that they had accumulated. And if I have time, I'll talk about that a bit more, in order to extract rents from the system. But then we also saw another type of which might more generally be called entrepreneurship, where a person took a large contract from the market, distributed that to people in the local labor market, freelancers, contractors in their local labor market that didn't have necessarily access or knowledge of the online labor market, managed the delivery, the performance and delivery of that project, and then delivered it back to the client. So for example, Sheila in Manila says thus. So she did transcription of audio files into text. Not highly skilled work, but does require some skill. I wear the proofreader's hat, the editor's hat, whatever else that's left, and local subcontractors do just the raw transcription. I look at myself as someone who is employing other people, training them. So these subcontractors were not in a formal employment relationship with her, but she had found them, if I remember correctly, by actually advertising in sort of local classifieds. So she was growing her own network of subcontractors locally and bringing work from UK, from United States, into the sort of Manila local labor market. And so this is an example of entrepreneurship. This is not just self-employment. This is entrepreneurship where she actually has some growth potential. She's stepping up in the value chain, taking up management functions that perhaps previously were performed in an agency somewhere in the UK or US or elsewhere. At the same time, she might be in a position to exploit her local workers. If she was quite careful not to let the local workers know where she gets all these clients. So then let me finish with asking, what is new? So a lot of the things we've been talking about today, I mean, what does the online do the online platforms make a difference? We have all kinds of exploitation and non-standard employment arrangements going on as it is without online labor markets. A gentleman who came to install my Sky internet when we moved, I learned that Sky had outsourced this task to British Telecom, which had outsourced, because I interviewed him a bit, which had outsourced it to OpenReach. And then OpenReach had contracted a local company here in Oxford called Kelly Communications. And then Kelly Communications subcontracted my Paul here to come to my home. And he was tracked by GPS, paid by job, by gig, and he was unpaid for the work time he spent sitting in traffic, so the labor-work ratio was poor. We live in this kind of situation of overall economic insecurity, and Karen Gregory mentioned that people feel pushed to go on these platforms. So I think we may be looking at that, we may be sometimes blaming sort of placing the blame on the wrong party if we say the platforms have caused this, if they're more of a symptom than a cause of what we observe. In fact, platforms are an easy target because they make informal work practices and unlicensed activities more visible than before. They make them more formal. Airbnb makes unlicensed hotel business, which used to exist before as well, actually more regulable because now there is data on it, how much it happens. The existing sort of, I felt that there was also some nostalgia, romanticization of the industrial labor regime, of the standard employment relationship, of occupations, closed occupations controlled by occupational groups. Because we forget that those were also often vehicles of exclusion of minorities, of women, of immigrants. In London, there's the fight currently going on between Uber and London cabs. There's clearly a racial element to that, to be honest. And the same when minicabs came in the 70s, was a racial element to that as well. So I think what I want to do in the future, and I could talk about this a long time, but I would like to approach these platforms as a distinct form of economic organizing, a regime, a new, to some extent new regime that is not taking over the whole world, but some people are subject to them now rather than to a state regime. So these platforms attempt to extract people from state-regulated labor markets, but they don't necessarily turn it into a laissez-faire marketplace where everything goes, which is what we sometimes think. Upwork has a minimum wage, has a global minimum wage. In November 2012, they decided, hey, let's have a global minimum wage. And suddenly, everywhere from California to Bangladesh had the same minimum wage, which is something the labor movement has been trying to make happen for 200 years. And it came with its own problems as well. So then the next day, Bangladeshi workers come online to the forum and complain, you've destroyed our livelihoods because the only way we earned money was by undercutting the Indians, and now you've forced us to. Anyway, so I'm just gonna finish there and say that I think to some extent the platforms are they're commodifying labor, but they're not necessarily leading into this kind of massification. They're unintentionally, but sometimes also intentionally maintaining fragmentation in order to prevent labor organization, which is something that my paper talks about more. And then finally, they are also facilitating entrepreneurship, at least some platforms, not Mechanical Turk, but Upwork, for example. And understanding how this institutional regime differs from the sort of, if you want to call it industrial regime, labor regime, I think is very interesting. And how do, in this new situation, workers attempt to lobby for their rights? Do they go to the state, or as we often see, they go now to the platform provider, as if the platform provider was the state, to demand their rights? These are the things that I want to study. Okay, thank you very much.